yourself a piece of cake and make yourself at home. I'm sorry that I can't cook steak, but cake is so high tone.
Welcome to our virtual summer reading program 2020, Imagine Your Story. Imagining your story also refers to reflecting on your personal story, the influences that have shaped your past and will continue to shape your future. For many of us, food is something that has played a huge role in our lives. Think back to the delicious spreads at family gatherings or church potlucks and imagine some of your go-to recipes. One of our fun activities this summer is creating a cookbook based on your family recipes and stories. We invite customers of all ages to submit a recipe that is meaningful to you or your family in some way, one that is part of your story. Log on to our website at www.wilsoncountypubliclibrary.org by August 7th, 2020 for information on how to submit your recipe. Library staff will compile your submissions into a document and upload it to our website where you can download to your computer or print. Be sure to join us for the rest of the summer reading program, where we are offering reading prizes and incentives, as well as programs for all ages via our Facebook and YouTube channels. If you haven't yet signed up for summer reading, please visit our website or call us to learn how. Now keep watching this video for a cooking demonstration and story from library staff, and keep reading too. Hello, and welcome to another cooking demonstration as part of 2020's summer reading program, Imagine Your Story. Now, stories mean all kinds of things, and in these cooking demonstrations, we're exploring the concept of the family story. But there is more to the story of cooking than just family. Family is intertwined with the history of cooking. So today I'm going to use a family recipe that is a very historical recipe, and we're going to learn a bit more about how we cooked back in the day. So the recipe I have chosen today is one for a plain family cake, and I found it in the pages of this book, McKenzies 5,000 Receipts, which was published in 1858. Now, receipts back in the day didn't mean receipts like at the grocery store. Receipts meant instructions. And you can see where recipes would come from receipts. They're instructions on how to cook. Now, McKenzies 5,000 Receipts is not just a cookery book. I love how it phrases it. It says that if all other works in the world were destroyed, this one volume would contain the sum of mankind's total knowledge at that point. That's a pretty impressive book, I think. It does contain everything from instructions on how to build roads to what to do if you swallow a bee. But it does also have a few pages of recipes in it. Now, when I say that I found this recipe in the pages of McKenzies, I'm telling the truth. It's not actually one of the recipes in McKenzies, but in my copy of McKenzies, I found this handwritten recipe. To make a good family cake, take 2 pounds of flour, 1/2 pound butter, 1/2 pound white sugar, 1 pint milk, 3 eggs, 1 gill yeast, and 1/2 spoonful mace or other spice to your taste. Mix well half your flour with your yeast and milk and let it stand till perfectly light. Then put it in your pans and bake. So I love that I have this recipe from this mysterious baker back in the day who got this recipe maybe from a friend, from a family member, wrote it out in beautiful copper plate, and tucked it inside their book for future use. So this recipe is for a plain family cake. Now, a plain family cake is exactly what it says, very plain. It's not a cake that's designed to be eaten just by the square or with icing. It's not a fancy wedding cake or anything. It's a plain cake, more like a shortcake or a scone almost, that is designed to be eaten with berries and cream. So we're gonna explore some recipes related to that so that we can make the full dessert. But right now, let's look at this recipe in more detail and get started. So, you noticed something when I was telling you about the ingredients. It's interesting the measurements of the ingredients back in these days. Today we measure pretty much everything in cups, teaspoons, tablespoons. Back then, a lot of the measurements were by weight, and that is actually still how they do it in most of the world. Most of the world measures dry ingredients by weight, not by volume. But at some point in the 1800s, America shifted away from measuring by weight and shifted to measuring by volume. But these older recipes still measure by weight, so you have to be able to weigh the items. So I have a scale here so that I can weigh my items. There's also some interesting units of measurement in these. Standardized measurements evolved. You'll often hear the legend that Fanny Farmer is the one who invented measuring cups. Now that is not true. Fanny Farmer, in her famous cookbook, definitely promoted the use of measuring cups and probably had a large part in influencing the general population towards the use of measuring cups. But measuring cups were around before then. You could buy them in any local store. However, a lot of people didn't have the money to invest in a set of cups just to measure stuff, so they would use whatever they had lying around the house. So you will see a lot of interesting units of measurement in these older recipes. You will see butter the size of a walnut. You will see measurements by teacups and wine glasses, because presumably you did have that around the house. You will also see the spoons are literally teaspoons and tablespoons, either the kind of spoon you stirred your tea with or the kind of spoon you ate with at the table. So it's a lot less standardized and a little more loosey-goosey, but it can be a very fun thing trying to translate these units of measurement. So when I was reading my recipe, you probably noticed that I was saying a pound of flour, a pound of sugar, pint of milk, that's standard enough, but then I mentioned a gill of yeast. What is a gill? A gill is an obsolete unit of measurement. It was used, it came out of the brewing industry, and it was basically equivalent to a half of a cup. So I'm going to be putting a half a cup of yeast in here. Okay, anybody who's a bread baker, who would ever put a half a cup of yeast in a recipe? Yeast comes in these handy little packets, right? And comes out to about, maybe, you might put anywhere from, say, 1 to 3 tablespoons of yeast in a recipe. You certainly would not put anything like a half a cup. So why is my recipe calling for a half a cup of yeast? That's because yeast was different back then. If you look in any recipe book of the era, you will see at the beginning of the section on how to bake bread, how to make your own yeast. Yeast back then was a liquid. You didn't just go buy these handy little granular packets. You used brewer's yeast and hops, potatoes, water. You brewed your own yeast and you bottled it and you used it over the course of a week. And then at the beginning of the next week, you would brew your own next batch of yeast, use that over the next week. The yeast of this period is somewhat halfway between beer and sourdough starter. You would put it in your recipe by the cupful. Now, much as I would love to partner with 217 Brew Works and experiment with actually brewing my own yeast, I think that's a little outside the scope of this presentation. So what I'm going to do, first thing I'm going to do as part of this recipe is try to approximate what that yeast would be. So I need a half cup of liquid yeast. So the first thing I need is a half cup of liquid. Now, I could use just water or milk, but because it is brewed with hops and yeast and all of that good stuff, I'm going to approximate the flavor of the yeast by using a half a cup of beer. Into that, I'm going to add just a little bit of brown sugar. That's a fundamental part of all the recipes. Sometimes white sugar, but you'll usually see brown sugar. And it gives my yeast a little something to work on. There we go. And then I am going to add my modern day packet of yeast. One packet's usually good for most recipes, so that's just what I'm going to chuck in here. I have to say, when you think about having to brew your own yeast, bottle it, store it at the beginning of every week just to be able to make bread, it definitely makes you see why a lot of people just went to the baker and bought bread. Cookery back then was much more of an undertaking than cookery now. So I'm stirring together my yeast, my active dry yeast, and my brown sugar into my beer. Just let that sit to one side. while we start measuring our other recipe. So while that yeast is sitting, I'm going to go ahead and get started on the rest of my recipe. Now it says to mix well half your flour with your yeast and milk and let stand until perfectly light. So half my flour, it wants 2 pounds of flour, so that's 1 pound. Now handily enough, I could buy a 2-pound bag of flour, so I don't even have to bother with measuring this by weight. I'm just gonna go ahead and dump half the bag in there. Just using regular old all-purpose flour. There we go. So I've got half my flour, and now I want 1 pint of milk and my yeast. 1 pint. These 2 cups. Go ahead and measure that. Here we go. Doing, oh yeah, that looks good. Pour that into my milk, stir that up. Got some yeast in my milk, and I'm going to stir that into my flour. Stir that until it's well blended. And you'll notice that this is not thick like a bread dough. That's because we're going to add the remaining half of the flour later. That's pretty well mixed. I'm going to just set that to one side to rise. Okay, so I have made my batter out of half my flour, my milk, and my yeast, and set that aside to rise. Now to see what the recipe tells me to do with the rest of the ingredients. Okay, let rise until perfectly light. Okay, then put it in your pans and bake. Helpful. Okay, so this is another thing about these older recipes. They assume you know how to cook. A lot of them will give you just vague directions, or in this case, stop the directions halfway. So it told me how to make the initial batter, but it tells me nothing about what to do with the other half of the flour, the sugar, the mace, the butter, the eggs. It's all a mystery and it's all up to me. Now it seems pretty obvious that I'm going to mix the sugar and the flour and the mace together to make a dry ingredients mix that I will stir into the batter. The eggs, I think I can probably just add that to the batter when I'm doing the blending. But the real question is what to do with the butter, because what I do with the butter will have a big effect on the texture of the finished product. So I did some research on similar cake recipes and found some with more complete instructions, and I saw about a 50-50 mix. About half of them had you melt the butter and mix that in with the initial batter, and about half of them had you chop the butter and rub it into the dry ingredients before you mix that with the batter. One very fascinating recipe had me melt the butter into the milk, then skim the butter off the milk and stir that into the flour. It's all a texture thing, and whatever I do will affect the texture. So the butter was not mentioned in my initial batter, so I'm going to go ahead and go with plan B, which is chop the butter into my dry ingredients and rub it in. So let's go ahead and do that. So my dry ingredients, my remaining ingredients that are on my list are the other half of the flour, one pound of sugar. So I need to be able to weigh that, so I've got my handy weighing scale right here. Got that tiered so that it says 0, and I'm going to go ahead and measure 1 pound. Here we are, 1 pound of sugar. Let's see. 1/2 spoonful mace or other spice to your taste. Well, I have to admit I have failed you, lovely audience. I completely overestimated my ability to find mace in Wilson, North Carolina. Mace is a spice that is kind of gone out of fashion recently. It's a very traditional spice, and it's apparently harder to find these days. So instead of mace, I've had to opt for other spice to your taste. And the spice I've opted for is nutmeg. The reason for that is that nutmeg and mace are actually part of the same plant. In fact, mace is made out of the seed covering of the nutmeg seed. So they have a kind of a similar flavor profile, and the substitution shouldn't be too noticeable. Now, it says half a spoonful. It doesn't say teaspoon or tablespoon. I get to guess. Now, this is where having basic cooking experience before you go into historical recipes is very important, because generally speaking, when you're measuring spices, you're talking teaspoons. So I'm going to go ahead and do half a teaspoon of nutmeg. Now, this is the way my mother taught me to grate nutmeg, because we didn't have a spice grater, and I've never been inclined to waste the kitchen space on having one. So the way we grate nutmeg in my house is you need a nice serrated steak knife and your whole nutmeg, and then you just grate like that. It's very easy to do, and it's a nice way to get fresh nutmeg for your recipes. Now, rather than have you stand here and watch me grate it, I went ahead and grated some a little earlier. So there's my nutmeg. One of the fun things about cooking is doing things the way you were taught by your family. And in my case, using the family dishes. These are my grandmother's bowls, and you'll see more and more of my family's kitchen utensils as we go along. I love the old kitchen utensils. They just have a lovely, lovely wedding present, and these multicolored Pyrex sets are just so pretty. So I'm stirring my flour and my sugar and my mace together. Here we go. Nice blend there. Okay, half a pound of butter. So I'm going to go ahead and chop that into that, and then rub it in by hand. It's nice and cold. And I'm just going to dice it in there nice and fine. That'll make the rubbing easier. This is the same kind of method you would use to make like a shortcake, even scones. So this will result in a flakier and slightly coarser texture than I might expect if I'd used melted butter. The butter, little hard bits of butter melt and leave little pockets in the finished dough. And in a way, this is one way of leavening back in the day. And leavening is very interesting in this time period, because you'll notice this is a cake, and normally in a cake we would be using baking powder, baking soda maybe. Wasn't invented yet. Back in this time it was all about yeast, or a lot of those cakes that were raised by using beaten egg whites. So yeah, no, baking powder just wasn't an option in this time period. Got that all chopped in, and now I'm going to just rub that in by hand. Okay, so I finished rubbing the butter into my flour and sugar mixture. You'll notice it makes a nice coarse grain crumble. You want it to be fairly fine. You don't want to leave any big chunks of butter, just a nice granular crumble. So that's all mixed, and I'm going to just let that sit to one side and add it to my yeast mixture once it's risen. So while we're waiting for that batter to rise, let's get started on the next part of our dessert. Now, what I'm making is a plain cake, which is to say a cake that is designed to be eaten with fruit and cream. Let's see. I think I saw a whipped cream recipe in McKenzies. Let's see what that looks like. Whipped cream. Mix the whites of 8 eggs, a quart of thick cream, and half a pint of sack. Let's see, that's a type of wine. Sweeten them to taste with double refined sugar, It may be perfumed with a little musk or ambergris, tied up in a rag and steeped in a Okay, so musk and ambergris are both used in perfumery. Musk is from the anal glands of a beaver. Ambergris is quite literally whale barf. Thank you, Mackenzie. I think I'll find a different recipe. So instead, I'm going to see what Ms. Leslie advises. This is Ms. Leslie's Directions for Cookery in its Various Branches, dated 1847. And she has a recipe in here called clotted cream. Now, you may be thinking about actual clotted cream, which is a sort of thickened halfway between whipped cream and butter that is served on scones and is absolutely lovely. But looking at this recipe, I don't think that's what it's going to make. Let's see what this recipe involves.
Clotted cream. Mix together 1 gill of rich milk, a large wineglass of rosewater, and 4 ounces of white sugar. Add to it the beaten yolk of 2 eggs. Stir the mixture into a quart of the best cream. Set it over hot coals and let it just come to a boil, stirring it all the time. Then take it off, pour it into a glass bowl, and set it away to get cold. Eat it with fresh strawberries, raspberries, or with any sort of sweetmeat.
So clearly this recipe is designed to be eaten with fruit, so that sounds like we're in the right area. Now, that list of ingredients is definitely not going to give me anything comparable to actual real clotted cream. Reading that list of ingredients, what I'm going to expect out of this is probably something similar to a crème anglaise or a English custard, which is to say a thin pourable custard that you would pour over the fruit and eat. Should be quite lovely. So let's look at those ingredients. It wants a gill of rich milk. From our previous recipe, we know that a gill is half a cup. So let's measure that out. And I'm just going to measure all this right in my saucepan because why waste another bowl? Okay, a gill of rich milk, a large wine glass of rose water. Now this is an interesting facet of this recipe, both the wine glass and the rose water. Rose water is a very old-fashioned flavoring and was extremely common in use from the medieval period up through the 1800s, but it has really fallen out of favor in the 1900s and of course now. You might be able to find it at a very fancy, yuppie eatery, but most of the time you're not going to see rose water listed in any recipes. We tend to think of florals as flavoring scents for soap, not flavorings. But floral flavors were extremely popular for a long period, partly because they were a lot more achievable than expensive spices. You might not be able to afford to go to the market and buy cinnamon, but you could pick your own rose petals and make your own rose water out of your back garden. So rose water was kind of the vanilla of its day. Vanilla is a fairly recent passion for our taste buds, and you won't see it mentioned very often in these older cookbooks. You will see in the place where you might expect vanilla, you will often see rose water. And of course, here we are with our old-fashioned measuring unit, 1 large wine glass. And yes, I did have to buy my rose water online. You can definitely not track this down locally. 1 large wine glass. This always makes me think of my mother's wine glasses, which growing up we called goodbye jelly jars. Because back in the day, the banks used to, as well as having very good interest rates, bribe you to join their bank by giving you freebies. And when she joined this bank, their slogan was, goodbye jelly jars, hello wine glasses, and she got her wine glasses free. So, goodbye jelly jars. So there's my large wine glass of rose water, 4 ounces of white sugar. So let's go ahead and get out our scale and weigh 4 ounces of sugar. There we go. And we'll just whisk that together. So to that we are supposed to add the beaten yolk of 2 eggs. you'll see this a lot in old cookbooks because their eggs were farm-raised hens. It's not as necessary with modern egg production, but always split your eggs or even crack your eggs over a separate dish. That way, in case you happen to get a bad egg, it doesn't mess up all of your expensive eggs. There. That's the way my mother taught me to split eggs. Set the whites this way. There's my yolks. And I'm gonna beat those. Okay, let's put that into the pot. Beaten yolks of 2 eggs. Stir that together. That rose water smells divine. Now we're going to stir that mixture into a quart of the best cream. Now I'm not quite sure what the best cream is. One interesting aspect of doing these older recipes is that some of them don't turn out quite the same because these days, unless you go to a very local dairy, all of our cream is highly pasteurized and homogenized, and so it behaves a little differently when it cooks. So I'm going to do a quart of whipping cream, figuring that was probably the best. Now you'll notice this is making quite a lot of custard, and that is another thing to watch out for with these older recipes. They were cooking for an entire household. They were cooking for a farmyard full of people. So if you want to have these in more normal human amounts, generally start by at least halving the recipe. This will keep me in custard for a while. Okay, so I've got that all mixed together and I can start to cook it. Now it says to cook it over hot coals. That's not very helpful when dealing with a modern stove. So what hot coals do is they give you more constant heat, but the temperature of the coals can vary depending on if there's more ash, what kind of wood they're from. So this is again where I have to pull out my basic cooking experience. And knowing that this is probably going to make something like a custard, I'm going to cook it on a medium because that's usually what you cook custards on. So I'm going to take this over to the stove and start cooking it. So the directions say to cook until just boiling. And because I think this is going to turn out as kind of a custard, I know that it is very important to make sure that it does not come to a full boil or that will kind of ruin the texture. So I'm going to cook this on medium heat until it just shows signs of starting to bubble and then take it off the heat. This is going to take a while, so I'll be back with you in a minute. Okay, so it's about half an hour later and I'm finally starting to see the first signs of boiling in my custard. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the heat and take it off the heat. I'll let it sit in the pot for a few minutes to cool down somewhat, and then I'll transfer it to a glass bowl and put it in the refrigerator to chill. Okay, it's about 2 hours later and my yeast batter has doubled in size, so I'm going to interpret that as perfectly light. So I'm going to go ahead and stir it all together. First, I'm going to take my 3 eggs and beat them well. Whisk those up. I'm going to go ahead and just stir that into my flour mixture. it's turning into a kind of a dense dough. Now I'm going to go ahead and stir that into my yeast mixture. Stir this until it's nice and smooth. There we are. It's kind of, and there's my finished batter. So I could cook this cake in any kind of pan. I could use perfectly modern pans. A lot of the pans of the period were tin or earthenware. But when I cook this kind of plain family cake, I'm partial to cast iron. It cooks up a beautiful crust on the cake. And there's just something about cast iron that's very satisfying to cook with. I love, we have familial cast iron that's been handed down through the generations, and I have one frying pan at home. My mother remembers, so my grandfather was a great lover of animals, and if he found any abandoned animals anywhere, he would bring them home, look after them. They had a couple of squirrels growing up and that kind of thing. And we have one frying pan at home that my mother says she remembers vividly. She came home one day and her father had rescued a whole nest of baby crows, and they were in the frying pan because for some reason that's what he decided they would be using as their temporary nest. So don't worry, this is not that frying pan. You aren't eating after baby crow. Buttered that frying pan well so that the cake will slide out easily. Then I pour my batter in. Now this is a cake, this is not a bread, so for a yeast cake you do not have a second rise like you might for a bread. I'm just going to go ahead and put that straight in the oven, and I'll see you when it's done baking.
So now comes the fun part of any cooking demonstration, the final taste test. Let's see how it turned out. So here's what my cake ended up looking like. It rose beautifully, as you can see. I was a little concerned because it took almost an hour and a half to bake. I was concerned about it being done in the middle, but once I've cut it, you'll see it came out beautifully. It's a lovely dense crumb, cooked clean all the way through. I am so excited to try this cake. My custard? Okay, so I'm gonna fess up. Here's one of the interesting things about doing historical cooking is it's very experimental. And there's a lot of times you spend going, did I do something wrong? Or is that how it's supposed to be and it just seems weird to a modern palate? In this cake, I'm pretty sure I did something wrong because my custard did not set. By the time it had chilled, it was still just as liquid as when it had started. Now, was that how it was historically supposed to be? I don't think so. Two reasons. One, I cooked the ingredients. Now, in modern days, we might have cooked it because there were eggs in it, and we might have cooked it to kill the salmonella. But they weren't thinking of that kind of thing back then. They would have been cooking it in order to transform it somehow. The other clue is in the name of the recipe, clotted cream. Clotted implies thickened. So I think I did something wrong. So what I ended up doing was I added another couple of egg yolks and cooked it again. And at that point, it set beautifully, and I have a lovely custard here ready to pour. Now, because this is a plain cake and custard, I also need fruit. That could be fresh fruit, it could be cooked fruit, it could be some variety of preserves. It just so happens that the lady down the street gave me a jar of homemade strawberry jam. Perfect timing, thank you so much, Ms. Linda. And so I'm going to be serving that with my custard and cake today. So let's go ahead and plate that and see what it looks like. So you can see how that cake turned out. Look at that gorgeous dense crumb. I cannot wait to try that. So let's put a little bit of the jam on top of that. This looks delicious. some of that on there. Spread that around a little. Homemade strawberry jam, nothing better. And now we'll pour a little of the custard over the top. Look at that. Gorgeous. So the most important question, of course, is how does it taste? Let's find out. The rosewater flavor is very evident. And so whether you like it or not will depend on how much you like your rosewater. It adds an interesting floral note to counteract the fruitiness of the strawberry jam. So I think you should try it at some point just to experience what those floral flavors taste like. It's a very intriguing and different kind of flavor palette than we're used to. The strawberry jam, of course, is marvelous. The cake is delicious. It is a gorgeous texture. That's going to be good. I'm going to probably eat some more of that with lemon curd. Would be fabulous with this cake, I think. So yeah, I'm going to say that that was a very successful experiment. So if you enjoyed this cooking demonstration and are interested in trying some historic cooking over your own, I'll recommend a couple of books from the library collection for you. Now, the books that I mentioned today in the course of cooking my recipe, those two books are not available in our library collection, but you can track down free PDFs on the internet because they are decidedly out of copyright. So if you want to pursue Ms. Leslie's cookery book or McKenzies 5,000 Receipts, just go online and search and you should find some free PDFs of those. Now, if you just want a historic cookbook in general, we have a couple of interesting reprint volumes in the library collection. The first one I'm going to recommend is The Carolina Housewife. That dates to 1847, so about the same era as Ms. Leslie's cookery book. And what's particularly interesting about this one is that it is the Carolina Housewife, so these are all local recipes to us. So this really is how our North Carolina ancestors were cooking. Also interesting is Housekeeping in Old Virginia. This one dates to 1879, and what I really like about this is it's a collection of recipes from a variety of Virginia cooks, and it really showcases the shift in cooking methods because you have recipes from ladies who've been cooking for 50 years and you have recipes from hip young housewives. So you can really see the transition in this cookbook from the older way of cooking to the new, more modern way of cooking. So I recommend this one as well. I hope you enjoyed today's historic cooking demo as part of our larger Cooking and the Story of Cooking project as part of summer reading. Please watch the other cooking videos and consider participating and sending in your recipes. I'd like to extend special thank you to the North Carolina Agricultural Extension Services for allowing us to use the kitchen at the Ag Center to film this program. Be sure to watch the rest of our programming and participate in Summer Reading 2020. We have reading incentives, prizes, programs for all ages, children to adults, and we'd love to have you join in. Thank you.
So one of the units of measurement that you heard me mention in the recipe was a gill. It requires 1 gill of yeast. Now what is a gill, not gill? Then put it in your pans and bake. Helpful. So this is another drawback to these old recipes. They assume you know what you're doing. You're gonna have to wait till you're done.
So if you enjoyed this cooking, okay, so it's time for the final fun part of any cooking demo, the unplating. So here is my finished cake. You'll see it rose very high. Oh, you stupid flies. Oh, goodness gracious. Okay, let's try that again. Maybe the fly won't come. Okay. Okay, so it's time for the final fun part of any kind of cooking video, the unplating. Or the plating, actually, not the unplating. Oh, the stupid flies. Oh, the stupid flies, stupid flies, stupid flies. Okay.
Woo!